Uh, my name is Katarzyna Gang-Szyboszyńska. I am Secretary of Logica Universalis Association. Welcome to this Logica Universalis webinar. And let me present our chair for today, Itala Dottaviano, editorial. She is a member of Editorial Board of Logica Universalis Journal, and today our excellent chairwoman. Itala, please.
Okay. A good day, good morning, good afternoon. It's very nice to be here with all of you. And it's a pleasure to share this session of the Logica Universalis webinar. After the first session of the World Seminar Series, Logica Universalis webinar, celebrating the World Logic Day on last January 14th, we are giving continuity to the program for the year 2022. As it is well known, the Logica Universalis webinar is connected to the journal Logica Universalis, to the book series Studies in Universal Logic, and the Universal Logic Project, which is an open platform to all scholars interested in the many aspects of logic. Today, my Brazilian colleague and friend, Rodrigo Freire, will present the associate organization responsible for the seminar, the Logic in the Plane, in Portuguese, Lógica no Avião. And the speaker, also a dear colleague and friend, Alexandre Costa-Leite, who will present a paper published by Logica Universalis in 2021. Lógica no Avião, Logic in the Plane, is an organization whose purpose is to promote and disseminate ideas developed in the scope of logic and philosophy. Rodrigo Freire, I suppose, will present some results and works by Lógica no Avião. Rodrigo de Alvarenga Freire has a grade in electric engineering by the São Paulo State University, Júlio de Mesquita Filho. He received a PhD in philosophy from the University of Campinas in 2009 and a PhD in mathematics from the University of São Paulo in 2014, Brazil. His experience is in the area of logic with emphasis in foundational studies. Currently, he is a professor at the Department of Philosophy of the University of Brasília, Brazil, where he is the coordinator of the graduate course in philosophy. He is the president of the organization Logic in the Plane, Lógica no Avião. It is relevant to remember that Rodrigo Freire was the winner of the first Brazilian Newton da Costa Prize. From the idea and experience of the Newton da Costa Prize, the Brazilian Logic Society assumed the prize in Brazil, and Jean-Yves Biziot suggested for several countries the creation of the prize, of an equivalent prize, of a national equivalent prize. At the next Unilog 2022, next April, we will have the second World Logic Prize contest with the participation of 15 countries. It is a pleasure for me to introduce today Rodrigo Freire and after also Alexandre Costa-Leite, both dear previous students of my university, of the Center for Logic, Epistemology, and the History of Science. And so, Rodrigo, please.
Thank you for your kind words. Thanks to all. So let me share my screen. Okay. So now I will present our organization, Logic in the Plane, Lógica no Avião, which is, as Itala already says, a non-profit organization whose only purpose is to promote and disseminate with speed and seriousness ideas developed in the scope of logic and philosophy. The main activities of the Logic in the Plane organization are book publishing and holding a seminar. So here is the website of the organization, lna.unb.br. That's the website. So we have already published 5 books, which are all open access. They can be downloaded from the website. We publish books in Portuguese and in English. So the first textbook that we have published is a book on topics in first order logic. It is in Portuguese, and it is mine. A second book in the L series is a book by Professor Miraglia on sheaves. It's one of the best introductions to sheaves and logic available. And these 2 books are in the L series, which is our book series dedicated to technical works on logic. The color of the series is gray, so all our books are published with this display in this series. The second series of our book publisher is the N series, and it publishes collections of papers, right? We have 1 book published in this series, which is a book dedicated to the seminar, the first 5 years of the seminar. It contains papers by Graham Priest, Yuri Balashov, and Fernando Ferreira, and many other great visitors that we had the pleasure to host. This is the only book up until now in the N series. And we have the A series, which is black. And in this series, we have 2 books by Kreisel. There are unpublished manuscripts by Kreisel, which are published in these 2 books. And these essays by Kreisel were arranged by Odifredi, and Odifredi published both books with us. So you can download both books in our website. It is freely available. So this is our book publisher dimension of the book publisher dimension of the organization. We also run a seminar, which is now temporarily suspended in virtue of COVID-19. All talks of the seminar are in person in Brasilia. We have organized 65 talks from April 2013 to February 2020, when the COVID-19 initiated. And then the seminar has stopped. We have not tried to run an online seminar because there are many online talks, online seminars around the world. So we decided that we will return with our old school style seminar when it is possible. You can also, in our website, you can see all the titles and visitors that we had in this seminar. There are other activities of the group, the research group associated with Logic in the Plane organized 4 editions of the colloquium UNB USP, right? Which okay. So the colloquium UNB USP is also an in-person colloquium, and it is suspended right now. You can see one of the previous events in this website. And as another activity of our organization, I should mention that 2 members of our team are currently running a YouTube channel called Ad Infinitum. They are launching 2 videos per week and approximately 100 videos on general logic and set theory are already available. All of them are in Portuguese. So this is the website of the channel, and you can see many interesting videos there. So this is a brief description of our organization, and feel free to email us if you are interested in our activities. Okay, so I will stop sharing now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I have a very nice question. Why the name? Why the title, Lógica no Avião? Logic in the Plane. Why the title?
There are some reasons for this title. Probably Professor Alexandre Costa-Leite is the best person to answer this question.
So the name is because the shape of the city of Brasilia looks like an airplane. So we have decided to put the name Logic in the Plane for this reason, especially. And because also we take people who are just passing through Brasilia and they stop at the airport, I'll go there and pick them and they give the talk and return to the airport and go back home. So this could be another reason why we have decided to select this name, Logic in the Airplane or Logic in the Plane. And the place where Brasilia is, it seems like an airplane. And the name is called Plano Piloto, so it would be a pilot plan. So these are the reasons.
Many thanks, Professor Alexandre. Now I'm going to introduce Alexandre Costa-Leite. He has a master from the University of Campinas, Brazil, and a PhD from the University of Neuchâtel, Switzerland. This under the advisory of Jean-Yves Béziot. His main interests are in non-classical logics, philosophy of logic, and metaphysics. Currently, he teaches logic and philosophy at the Philosophy Department of the University of Brasilia, Brazil. He is now our invited speaker. He is today our invited speaker, and he will present a paper published by Logica Universalis in 2021 The paper is Paraconsistent Orbits of Logics. This paper is a joint work with Idelcio de Souza, who is participating in the meeting from the University of São Paulo, and Diego Dias from the State University of Northern Paraná, Campus Jacarezinho, Brazil. So it's a pleasure to announce here Alexandre Costa-Leite, a very dear previous students of us at the Center for Logic, Epistemology, and the History of Science. We are always very proud of Rodrigo Freire and Alexandre Costa-Leite. Please, Alexandre, you have at most 5 minutes to present.
All right, thank you. I'll share here my screen.
Sorry, Diogo Dias is also participating in the meeting. He didn't appear here, but he is participating. So the 3 co-authors of the paper are participating in the presentation.
So, all right, this is a paper written by myself with Idelcio de Souza and Diogo Dias. They are currently working here with us, and this paper just appeared in 2021 in this journal, Logica Universalis, and I will be here presenting the main ideas of this paper, right? This is a research on ways which can be used to change the spirit of a given logic. If you take a logic which is not paraconsistent, in the sense that this logic rejects the principle of ex falso, if you take a logic which validates ex falso, how could we convert this logic into a paraconsistent logic? So the idea of our research is to study all these ways which can be used to, let's say, paraconsistentize a given logical system. And so the main problem we study is this one. Given a logic, I mean a logic in the sense that it does not, it's not paraconsistent. How can it be converted into a paraconsistent logic? I mean, how can we change the content of a given logic in order to make it paraconsistent? So we call this the problem of paraconsistentization, or the P problem. Paraconsistentization means indeed the plurality of mechanisms which can be used to convert, to transform a given formalism in order to make it paraconsistent in the contemporary sense. We mean a system which denies some form, some shape of the law, according to which, from a contradiction, everything follows. Of course, this definition of paraconsistent logic has some problems, because we could define, let's say, unary non-explosive operators in many logical systems, as pointed out by Jean-Yves Béziot, and also because this definition is based on the rejection of a principle, and we should find, as Jean-Yves says, positive properties respected by paraconsistent systems. So we take, anyway, we take the definition as this: a logic, if it invalidates the principle of explosion, then it is paraconsistent. Explosion, I mean ex falso, right? If you have a contradiction, anything follows. So we decided to classify different methods of paraconsistentization, different methods which can be used to convert a logic into a paraconsistent system. So we have this table here. and we distinguish between concrete and abstract methods of paraconsistentization. So I will briefly explain these three concrete methods which we can find in the literature, and then I will jump into abstraction, and I will explain these abstract methods of paraconsistentization, focusing in consistent sets, which will be one of our favorite strategies to paraconsistentize a given system. All right, so when we take this paraconsistentization by defining operators, this is of course a kind of concrete paraconsistentization, and we select as an example of this kind of paraconsistentization the work of Jaskowski. Jaskowski, he takes that classical logic, right? And he replaces the classical connectives by discussive operators. And he uses to determine whether something is a thesis or a theorem of the discussive system, the modal logic S5. So we think that in the case of Jaskowski, we have a paraconsistent dimension or a paraconsistent transformation from classical propositional logic using modal logics. But notice that he decided to use S5. We could use here whatever. It could be S4 or it could be K. So there is no need to select precisely S5. The traditional approach used by Jaskowski selects S5, but we could select other systems and generate other discussive systems using the strategy mentioned by Jaskowski in this paper. There we find the methodological theorem, number 1, number 2, the methodological theorems 1, 2, and 3, which can be seen as methods of paraconsistentization by defining operators. So this is one first example of how to change the nature of a given logic. In this case, classical logic has been replaced by this discussive logic, and there is even an informal algorithm that you can apply to prepare this conversion. The same we can find here in the case of Da Costa, the new hierarchy of paraconsistent logics. We can see this hierarchy as a paraconsistentization of classical logic. So you take classical logic in the proof theory, it could be axiomatic systems, it could be natural deduction, whatever. You take an axiomatic system, so you eliminate everywhere there is a negation, and then you define a special condition called the well behavior of a given formula, which means that the formula in some sense respects the principle of non-contradiction formulated in a given language. And then you replace all manifestations of negations by this weak negation, which is a paraconsistent negation. You will find new properties, and then you can generate paraconsistent systems using this strategy. And notice here, the important fact is that Da Costa selected the well behavior to be, let's say that alpha is well behaved if and only if alpha satisfies the principle of non-contradiction. But we could formulate other forms of well behavior. It could be whatever. It's just a matter of contingency that we have studied the case of well behavior as proposed by Da Costa. I mentioned here this article, which is the most famous article on this in English. And of course, this book here by Evandro Gomes and Itala d'Ottaviano, which will appear in English very soon. This book has the whole history of the CN systems and of course the history of paraconsistency in general. And it will soon appear in the Synthesis library. So we see this as a new way of paraconsistentizing. We call this paraconsistentization by well behavior. But notice that the well behavior studied in the literature is this one, but it could be whatever. It could be a formula which satisfies the excluded middle, for instance, or satisfy any other formula. And a whole new hierarchy of paraconsistent logics would raise in this case, right? The other concrete example we find in the literature is the case of the logic of paradox, which can be seen as a paraconsistentization of classical propositional logic in the way you change, Priest changed the set of truth values. Instead of only 2, we have 3. And he also changed the content of the designated values. So paradoxical is a new designated value. And in the case of the logic of paradox, it's interesting to see that it's the same logic of classical propositional logic considering theoremhood, but the consequence relation is not the same. So we think that whenever someone generates a paraconsistent logic, changing the set of truth values and going through many valued logics, we call this paraconsistentization by generating many values. So these 3 examples I have mentioned, they are forms of concrete paraconsistentizations. Now we go into a more general and abstract perspective, and we mention here the paraconsistentization by logical structures. Whenever you take a logic in this way, you can define new logical structures, L sharp, with the same domain and with a different consequence relation generated by some kind of operation, which we will not specify here. And this could be a box, for instance, could be a diamond. You have a logic, then you generate logics using a clause like this. This will produce a variety of orbits. Of course, not all of them will be paraconsistent, but in the case it is paraconsistent, this transformation, you could say that this is a way to paraconsistentize by logical structures. And each way used to paraconsistentize a logic, we call an orbit of a logic. So a logic, it has the orbits of this logic by any method used to paraconsistentize it. So the concept of orbit is whenever you generate a logic using a special restriction or using a special condition, you get an orbit or a class of logics which are generated by transformations. So I'll explain this later. The one typical example of paraconsistentization by logical structures is this case of anti-logic, the logic of rejected propositions, which are pretty well studied in the literature, and they were proposed by Łukasiewicz. And I see here in the talk Professor Skadowska, who also studied a lot of these systems. And we have these systems, the anti-logic of a given logic, which is generated by this condition. So it's very easy to see that if you take an anti-logic of an explosive logic, you will have a paraconsistent logic, of course, because if a logic satisfies X falso, so the anti-logic will not satisfy. So we have studied this logic and other forms of general logical structures in this paper, Logics and Their Galaxies. We call this abstract form of paraconsistentization by anti-logics. And now we'll concentrate here in the paraconsistentization by consistent sets, which is the method we explore in detail. And listen, All above forms of paraconsistentization give rise to specific orbits of logics. By the end of the talk, I will discuss this problem. And from now on, we'll show how to paraconsistientize using consistent sets. So in order to do that, check it out that for us, we use a logic in the regular sense of a logic, a set and a consequence relation, right? And we have the sets for subsets of X, and these are elements of X. We write that alpha can be deduced from gamma if and only if this pair belongs to the consequence relation. And we use abstract logic as a very general mathematical structure without any special restrictive action. So we do not need to impose the Tarskian conditions, but we could impose to discuss some topics. But at the beginning, this is not necessarily something that we will do. And if you want to check it out at the Theory of All Possible Logical Structures, there is this paper by Jean-Yves in the Logical Universalis. And this is the first paper in this series, which is now currently a journal called Logical Universalis. This is the first paper of all this sequence of publications. And here you can find the theory of all possible logical structures. So fixing terminology, we'll say that set of formulas is L consistent with respect to L, if and only if there is a formula in X such that gamma does not deduce this formula, right? On the other hand, we'll say that if alpha is a consequence of gamma for all alpha in X, then so we say that gamma is L inconsistent with respect to a given logic L. We do not specify what logic is this one. It's just general logic. And so we say that the set of L consequences given by this condition, right? And this is the Tarskian operator of consequence, which is defined in the power set, from the power set of X to the power set of X. Of course, if we want to discuss some particular properties of logical systems of paraconsistentization, we also have to take into account the classical restrictions developed by Alfred Tarski, right? And in some moment, we'll use the fact that L is normal. Paraconsistentization by consistent sets is the following. We take a logic as an abstract logic, and we introduce a general transformation in the class, which will give rise to a logic PL, which is the paraconsistentized version of L. And this one is defined like this. We say that alpha is a consequence of gamma in the paraconsistentized logic, if and only if there is a consistent set, L consistent with respect to L, such that this consistent set deduces alpha. So check it out here that Da Costa and Venengo, indeed, they have developed something called paraclassical logic, in which this idea here is developed for classically consistent. So in our case, we avoid the fact that this is classically consistent, and we define consistency without any reference to negation, using only a general logic. And every time this condition is applied, we'll say that we have a P transformation or a paraconsistent transformed version of the logic L. And this kind of paraconsistentization is called paraconsistentization by consistent sets. And of course, if you listen there in Da Costa, Jaskowski, and Priest, we have something different. Here, we are changing the nature of the consequence relation. We are not changing locally the defined operators like negation, for instance. We are changing the content of the consequence relation of the V dash. So in this sense, this paraconsistent transform changes or modifies the consequence relation, giving rise to a paraconsistent consequence relation because only consistent sets are used and we do not have any reference to any negation operator. We could say for this reason that it would be possible indeed to define the category or the category of logics, which objects will be consequence structures or logics defined in that previous sense. And the morphisms would be translations, injective translations. So we could think about this P, if we want, as a functor connecting, let's say, the category of logics which are explosive and converting these logics into paraconsistent logics in a category of non-explosive logics. So this could be viewed as an injective functor, right, which preserves consistent sets. So this would be the most general perspective concerning paraconsistentization to study the P transformation as a functor. This is something we have done like 4 years ago, the point here in this paper in Logica Universalis is that we explain some of our previous papers and notice that when you take a logic which is monotonic in the regular sense, so the logic is in general, abstract logic in general, the PL also has to be monotonic, right? And the same holds for this finiteness property. Finiteness property is the following. If gamma deduces alpha, so there is a finite subset of gamma which also deduces alpha, right? So this finiteness property is invariant under the P transformation. And now we define this. We say that a logic satisfies the conjunctive property if and only if there is in the language something which looks like or simulates the behavior of a conjunction, but it's not necessarily a conjunction, it could be whatever, but the conjunctive property is this property. If you have a delta from this set, then there is a formula from which you can deduce delta in the same language, right? And the consequence relation of both will be the same. We say that a logic now, we introduce a negation operator, and we say that it satisfies explosion if and only if you take all gamma here, and there is an alpha such that gamma proves alpha and proves also the negation of alpha, then gamma is L inconsistent. It would be paraconsistent if this gamma here, of course, is not L inconsistent, but it is consistent. It means you can have contradictions without explosion. And we say that a logic with a negation operator satisfies joint consistency if you can find two, let's say, sets like this, which are consistent, but when you put both together, you have an L inconsistent set. In this sense, we have a sufficient condition on this structure in order to have a guarantee that the paraconsistentized version is really a paraconsistent version. So we call this the fundamental theorem of paraconsistentization, which is this one here. If L is an abstract logic, now with negation operator and explosive normal Tarskian, satisfies joint consistency and also conjunctive property, then PL is paraconsistent. And then this fact shows that we have only sufficient conditions to convert a given logic into a paraconsistent logic. We think this is the most important result we have. I'll not explain here, but we have also, this case, we paraconsistentize using a very general logic. We could produce the same here for axiomatic formal systems. We could develop mutatis mutandis, a result like this for a concrete paraconsistentization in the domain of axiomatic formal systems, or at the semantical level. And we call this paradeduction and paraconsequence, which are particular cases of this general technique for consistent sets. Look that in the literature, you can find other strategies using the idea of consistency to build or to reason with sets containing contradictions. But our idea is to study the process of converting a logic, which is not a paraconsistent, into a paraconsistent logic. So this is our fundamental point and idea. We are studying the process, not specific ways of reasoning with subsets which are consistent. And now we have developed a new form of paraconsistentization in this paper, which we call the paraconsistentization by multi-deduction. When you take a multi-deductive system, the idea appeared in this paper, and we use the multi-deductive abstract logic. It is something like this, but we put many, let's say, specific consequence relations between the mother structure, the mother consequence relation, and the set X, which is a set of formulas, could be a set of formulas. Definition is the same, and we will say that something, alpha, is deduced from gamma if and only if we can find a compartment in which alpha is deduced from gamma, right? And in this case, of course, this is the same thing, but now reflected by consequence structures. The whole logic would be the union of all those small logics, right? And the way you decide to slice the consequence relation depends of what you want to do, depends of what are your intentions. And notice that when we have a system of natural or a system of multi-deduction, we can have a situation like this. You can have a compartment proving alpha and another compartment prove the negation of alpha. Although the logic will not be trivial because the formula beta, for instance, could not be deduced for all K's, let's say, right? And in this sense, we would have that the main mother structure would prove alpha and not alpha, but not any formula. And so those criticisms concerning the definition of paraconsistency, they do not apply here, because here we could have paraconsistency even with classical negation. I'll give an example of how to paraconsistentize using multi-deductive logic. Let's take the classical propositional logic, conceived as multi-deductive logic. The alphabet, we take AT, the set of atomics, right? Negation, conjunction. And now we change something, we change the consequence relations using a very special technique we have developed. So we take, of course, the whole set X of classical formula has this shape here. And here, if you use these recursive definitions, so you can have the whole set X. But now, what we'll do is the following. We'll take independent sets. You take this set AT, XAT, with only atomic sentences, and this set X negation, which is given by these two clauses only. If something is atomic, the negation belongs to X negation. If something belongs to X negation, then the negation also belongs to X negation. So this set X negation, it's a very small set. You have, let's say, formulas with negation in front of them. And we could do the same here and define this auxiliary set X and which would be a set with conjunctions. We would have only conjunctions inside the set X and, right? And now what we do the following. We first notice that when you take XAT, X negation, and X and, the union of all this, of course, is a subset of X, but something is missing. Something is missing because the way we have used it to construct that multi-deductive system, it does not contain any kind of interaction between formulas. For instance, if you have the negation of a conjunction, you do not have the negation of a conjunction in this set here. So we need something, and this something which is missing in order to get the whole set X, we call the X star the ghost set. And when we put the ghost set here, of course, adding interactive formula, so we have the whole set X. And let L star be this big logic, a multi-deductive abstract logic, expressing the whole inferential power of classical propositional logic. So the main consequence relation is given by this structure here. And now we have 7, let's say, auxiliary consequence relations, which are components of L star, and they are defined in the following way. So here we have V-1, in which we can deduce, given an atomic, we can deduce another atomic. Here we can have sets of atomics and atomics in the other side. So here we could have P and some P and R. This would follow R because this is controlled by classical logic as we are paraconstantizing classical propositional logic. But you check it out here. This is the consequence relation of the ghost set. And we have all these 6 auxiliary consequence relations. And of course, by the way they were constructed, we can see that 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 are paraconsistent by nature. They were born as paraconsistent fragments because here is not explosive, because you do not have a way to construct explosion here, right? You don't have, because it's fixed that you can reason here only taking a single atomic. So it's impossible to have this fragment as a paraconsistent logic. And the same whole, it's possible. This is a paraconsistent fragment. And we have many paraconsistent fragments. So you could say, oh, but in this case, it is paraconsistent because you do not have elements to formulate explosion. So you cannot deny explosion. Yeah, but notice that although this is controlled by specifying the nature of the set of formulas and imposing restrictions there, the logic in which we are is classical logic. So inside the mother structure, we have negation. We do have negation. So we find that, of course, the ghost fragment is explosive. He's not able to avoid explosion because it's regular consequence relation of classical logic, right? And we call this paraconsistentization as a paraconsistentization by multi-deduction. And notice now that each way used to generate logical structures from old ones leads to an orbit of a logic. And these orbits can be regular, they can build a whole hierarchy, can be irregular, complex, depending on how these logics were generated. So there are many forms, as we saw, that we can use to extract logics, paraconsistent logics from logics which are not paraconsistent. So we say that each P1, each PI here, P1, Pn, this is a sequence of different methods of paraconsistentization. So we define a paraconsistent orbit of a given logic, right? And this is, the orbit is given by all paraconsistentizations, all possible ways to paraconsistentize a given logic. So there are different ways, and these ways, they are not sometimes compatible or comparable. So we think that this situation can be explained by this, which is something here we find 4 orbits. Let's say we have a logic here in the center, in 4 different ways to generate a paraconsistent counterpart of this logic. So we call this the paraconsistent orbits. These dotted orbits here, they represent only that possible ways of paraconsistentizing which were not still developed, right? So we use this to reflect this plurality. You have a logic, so you can paraconsistize it in many different forms, and sometimes these forms are not comparable. And we say that we could put there some order relation between the methods of paraconsistentization, and we could say, for instance, that an orbit is smaller, let's say like this, than other one, if the inference relation of the first one is a subset of the second one. So in this sense, we could say that the 2 orbits are the same or are comparable if they share the same orbital plane. And differently, we would say that they are in different orbital planes. No? And the next figure shows that we have here a logic in the center, and we have 2 orbits which are, let's say, which produce the same logic here. And this one here, you can compare this orbit here with these 2 because they are in the same orbital plane, and we represent this situation using another paraconsistentization, not in this plane here, to represent the fact that this paraconsistentized version of L is not comparable with these logics here, these paraconsistent versions of these logics here. And the same thing we could do for theorems. There we defined orbits, the size of orbits using logical consequence. Here we use theorem hood. And in this case, we could also say that an orbit is smaller than the other one if the set of theorems is a subset. And the idea is that this notion of orbits provides a very general framework in which we can compare different paraconsistentizations using different parameters. And here we represent the paraconsistentization developed by da Costa as this structure. We have classical logic. Then this logic is paraconsistentized, giving rise to C1. Then you go through orbits up to the limit, which is C omega. And then it's a regular and hierarchical paraconsistent orbits. In this case, we would have, let's say, very, very regular structures to define a paraconsistent version of a logic. Of course, if you take Lukashevich's logic, when you produce orbits, paraconsistent orbits of Lukashevich logics, it will not work like this because the L systems, they are very complex and they are not in linear order. They form like a tree, something like this. And to conclude, we think that the technique of paraconsistentizing a logic by consistent sets is very stable. And we think that we have changed the way we reason concerning paraconsistency, because what we find is that many people study how a system of paraconsistent logic works. So we are trying to change perspective and look the situation of paraconsistency from this general perspective, instead of considering systems, particular systems of paraconsistent logics. We take the process of changing the nature, changing the spirit of a given logic in order to convert it into a paraconsistent logic. So we think that this paraconsistentization by consistent sets is stable, it's already studied, it's okay, but it's interesting maybe in the future to study other forms of paraconsistentization, possible paraconsistent orbits of a given logic and orbits in general, because you can generate orbits not only paraconsistentizing logic. You can do that in many different forms. And I think we logicians, we should develop a general theory of the orbits of logics. All right, thank you for coming. Thanks for your attention.
And many thanks, Alexandre, for this so interesting and well presented from the didactical point of view of your talk. Okay, I personally have a series of questions, but I prefer to open to our colleagues, the participants of the webinar. Okay, I don't know if there are questions. Yes, Alexandre, there are questions in the chat. Let's see.
Joseph Brennan said that the ghost fragment sounds very much alive. Yeah, it is indeed. We said it's a ghost because it was not there, Joseph, in the partition we have done of the original set X. And this ghost fragment allows interactions. So in this sense, it is pretty alive, really. And Fabian Shang says here that orbits match with the parlance used in the previous paper, logic in their galaxy. Yeah, in some sense, we are trying to think about logics using this astronomical, let's say, this astronomical metaphor, right? In order to think about logics. And in this paper, Logics and Their Galaxies, what we have done there is to develop the notion of a galaxy of a given logic. But here is something different. We go towards orbits in this precise sense of paraconsistent orbits, those orbits formulated by paraconsistentizations or p-transformations of a given logic, right?
Alexandre, there is an observation, also the first one by Andreas earlier. He says that IMO ex falso belongs to religion, not science. It's part of theology. What do you think about that?
Ex falso.
What is IMO?
Ex falso here in the sense when you have a formula, the negation of this formula, it entails everything. Of course, you could have, I haven't explored this and I haven't thought about this, but it seems to me we could give a theological interpretation to this principle, but it's out of my understanding right now. But
Alexandre, could you excuse me? In your book, mine and with Evandro Luis Gomes, the main discussion is concerned to ex falso circuito quadrilimit. It appears in several philosophers, having Aristotle, the Stoics as foreigners also, even they have never mentioned the principle, but the principle was very well discussed during the Middle Ages. And it does not belong to religion. It belongs to philosophy, to classical logic, and to certain kinds of non-classical logic as approved theorem. But we have a philosophical discussion about it and about its relevance and meaning. Okay, you have, in my opinion, okay, Andreas, in your opinion. Okay, thank you. Other questions, you could have your hands, put your hands and we could give.
There is someone here, Zeno Tufano asked whether there is a connection between orbits in group transformations. Indeed, we know that there is something called orbits in algebra, but the way we have developed orbits, it's independent of what is going on in algebra. All right, we tried to develop a free notion of orbit without any kind of connection concerning algebra. So I would say, apparently, there is no connection between both notions. orbit would be a path there, right? So here it's we're studying a very independent notion of orbit.
Any other questions, please? May I present some observations, Alexandre?
Sorry?
While people are thinking about other questions. First of all, many thanks for our presentation. I liked it very much. Your definition of paraconsistentizing a logic is, in fact, a special kind of obtaining conservative translations, according to our previous works on translations. I think that Delcio has also studied a lot of that. In our first paper in 1999 with Jairo José da Silva and Antônio Marusetti, we have proposed a general definition for the concept of translation between logics. And we have presented a very general definition, claiming that a translation between one logic and another is simply a function that preserves derivability. When this derivability is preserved both sides, we have a conservative translation. What is exactly what you have when we say that there is a function that paraconsistentize your logic. And so from the general results we have about conservative translations, maybe we could have some special results for these paraconsistentizations. When you say that a logic is an anti-logic related to another one, you are saying that there is no conservative translation between them. The definition of a logic and abstract logic as simply a set with a consequence operator was presented exactly in our first paper in 1999, this general definition. Here a question. The previous observations, but I think that we could discuss this in order to develop your work on paraconsistentization. This next observation is a question. Why do you think that paraconsistentization decreases the deductive power of a logic? Sometimes, I'm supposing, when the paraconsistentized logic is such that you can define within it, a strong negation, then not necessarily the deductive power of the logic is decreased. It's like, for instance, if you consider some paraconsistent logics as restrictions of classical logic, so you are decreasing the deductive power. But when you have the possibility of defining other internal connectives in the new logic, in general, you can prove that from that kind of view, the logic can be understood as an extension of classical logic. And so you would have an increasing of the deductive power. What do you think about that?
So you have said many things. And the first remark I have concerning translations, we use indeed the homomorphisms, which are in the case where we are studying the paraconsistentization functor. The morphisms are homomorphisms, they are injective. So in this sense, we do not have precisely conservative translations, because if you take two different formulas in the domain, this will give as output two different translations. The way we define this functor allows us to preserve consistent sets in such a way that we have a guarantee that when we apply the functor, we get a paraconsistentized version of a given logic, which is not explosive. The topic concerning the fact that paraconsistentization decreases the inferential power of a given formalism, the answer for this will depend obviously of what kind of paraconsistentization. If we take this paraconsistentization by consistent sets, it decreases the inferential power because we eliminate inference from contradictions, right? And of course, this is contentious. We could operate in a different, towards a different direction. But when we say that it decreases the inferential power, is because the consequence relation generated by the P transformation is indeed based on a restriction of the regular consequence relation. So it is in this sense that it is something which decreases the inferential power. But notice, we have studied this case concerning consistent sets. But of course, as I said about those concrete methods of paraconsistentization by Jaskowski, Da Costa, and Priest, we could also change another special condition. And instead of taking L-consistent subsets of gamma, we could take other things that you should develop and study. We have our final paper on the paraconsistentization, which converts many valid logics, classical, let's say Lukashevich, Gödels, and LP, things like that, into paraconsistent version of these logics. And this paper is already online, but it's not published. And this will be our last paper on this subject, and then we will study other things. But we think a research needs to have an end, right? And this is the final paper we will write on this subject. But we think that you could use other forms of paraconsistentization. Instead of L-consistency, you could take whatever, I don't know. And the decrease
I agree with you. Anyway, it depends on the context, on the approach you are taking. Concerning the first observation, in fact, relatively to your reply, I think that your function are special strict kinds of conservative translations. Yeah, I have another question. Paraconsistentization by multi-deduction, do you think that it could be related to the semantics of possible translations introduced by Carnielli, that in fact is associated to Jaskowski's intuitive ideas when he introduced his two papers of 1948, 1949, where he introduced the system D2. I think that there is a relation with the semantics of possible translations. What do you think?
Yeah, indeed, there is a clear relation with combining logics, because you can see these fragments as pieces of the original logic, and a multi-deductive system indeed is a kind of fusion of logics in which you combine every fragment of the of consequence relations and get the whole logical structure. If there are relations of these multi-deductive logics with other techniques or with other ideas, we have to check it out. Up to now, we see the relation with respect to combining logics. I think there's someone who wanna ask something. Jerry Chandler.
How do you know he has his hand?
Yes.
Okay, please.
Yeah, this is not so much a question as a comment, and perhaps something that might motivate further thought about the relationships you propose for orbits. I feel a little bit out of my league in even making this comment, but it might be of value to you. It is my intuitive feeling that an intuitive form of logic would insist that there's some relationship between your notion of orbits and, say, for example, the monster group. That's my intuitive feeling from an intuitional logic perspective. And of course, the number theory that I developed. So that's just my comment. I have no further developments of it. It's just there for you to think about.
Yeah, all right, thank you. We'll check it out. Could you please send to me this book, this material, and then we will check it out whether there is a connection or not. And thanks a lot for your comment. Please send to me this. This is my email.
Yeah. Oh, yes, yes, I will send you something.
The email is written in the chat, right? Please
Yes.
do send, and then we will check it out whether there is a kind of connection, because we are trying to develop the general theory of orbits now, and not only take into account paraconsistent orbit. So we will have to study this algebraic notion of orbit in some sense.
Well, I think you must look very closely at the monster group.
The monster group, so we have to see what is this precisely, and then we'll say, but thank you very much for your remark, which we'll take into consideration, right? Thank you.
You're welcome.
Many thanks, Jerry. Any other question, please? Yes. Who is here? Is another one. I don't identify. Is it? Maybe Jerry is saying. Alexandre, are you identifying another hand?
No, no.
No, no. Alexandre, a last observation. This approach you introduced for the comparability of paraconsistentized logics from the point of view of preservation of theoremhood, I think that you could also define this comparability by the existence of translations between the logics. And so you would have a distinct kind of orbits for this kind of category of logics. Maybe it could be a less strict, because our definition of translation is such that the derivability is preserved, not strictly theoremhood. And so you would not be restricting so much. Maybe we could discuss this after. It could be interesting, I think.
Yes. This case, if you take, for instance, theoremhood, you would see that the logic of paradox and paraclassical logic or classical logic indeed are the same concerning theoremhood, but not the same concerning the consequence relation, right? So we have to check it out how these orbits works, but we are pretty much interested in this idea of orbits of a given logic. And you could say, but how do you draw these diagrams? All these orbits. No, we select to write up to now in a free form. So we are still thinking about how to draw orbits precisely. What we can say is that if you have a hierarchy of logics, you could put elliptical orbits like planets, but of course there are some unexpected interactions between logics. The important thing concerning orbit is that we want to say that each way you use to generate a logic from a previous one, this gives rise to an orbit of a logic. And then we have to think about these transformations and about these orbits, especially in the field of universal logic, in which we take logic from a very abstract perspective. And we think the general theory of orbits of logics will play pretty well this whole.
Maybe you could develop an approach by using category
Yeah, yeah, we have done this in 2000.
Like categories.
Yes, we have done something like this in 2016. The paper is called, all references are in the current paper in Logica Universalis, right? And we have a paper called on a Paraconstantization functor in the category of consequence structures. In the category of consequence structures. In this paper, we have already developed this category, which is a very weak category because we do not have many universal constructions there. This is due to the fact that we eliminate restrictions on the consequence relation. But you can check it out, this paper on a Paraconstantization functor. It's a journal of applied non-classical logics.
Thank you, Alexandre. Evandro Luis Gomes has written, thank you very much for sharing with us these ideas and results. All the best. Time is going on. I would like to know if there is any other question. Okay, it seems that we have not. And so we could close this webinar. But I would like to know if Katarzyna has any other observation, announcement.
Yeah, thank you very much, Itala. Thank you everyone for this excellent meeting, especially to Alexandre, but of course to Edelso de Souza, Diogo Diaz, also for the paper. Thank you very much, Itala, for being excellent chairwoman and and for your great questions. And I would like to invite you all to join us for the webinar on March 9th, at 4 p.m. And the Jean Bezio will talk about the second World Logic Prizes contest, and I will present Logica Universalis Association. So I hope to see you all in 3 weeks, and thanks again very, very much.
I'd like to thank to, and especially to Katarzyna, to Rodrigo Freire, and to Alexandre Costa-Leite for the so excellent presentation.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I forgot Rodrigo, but it was great to hear about logic in the play. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Bye.
Let's close. Bye. Until next webinar.